Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had a wonderful, enjoyable day, illuminating and enriching discussion, and that you feel inspired and can't wait for tomorrow. My name is Michael Charles. I'm the Assistant Vice President and University Advisor for Equity and Inclusive Communities at Carleton University. And I'm joined by some esteemed colleagues today who are going to help us distill some of the discussion that took place earlier. I say some of the discussion. We will not be talking or referring to all of the concurrent sessions in the plenary discussion today. And hopefully those topics that we aren't able to cover will be represented by some supplementary or summary notes that will be distributed after we begin.
Thank you. So I was in the staff access and success session, and again, great discussions. So one of the things that we talked about in terms of barriers and challenges was around the complaints resolution process, and that they're not always adequate as people find when they go forward with issues. We found that sometimes people don't have the training or education around anti-racism in order to really adequately manage race-based complaints. And there's also the issue where staff issues or complaints tend to be dismissed or downgraded or recategorized. And so instead of calling racism out, you might say, oh, it's an interpersonal issue, or you're made to feel like you're the problem. And so that's something that is quite a challenge for people. The other thing we talked a little bit about was just also unequally applied discipline too, again, because you're dealing with folks sometimes who do not have the skill set, again, to be dealing with some of these race-based issues. There's a level of seriousness of managing the situation that varies wildly, again, depending on who you come forward to need help, to seek help. And so we talked about the importance of Black staff having safe places where they can go to raise their issues, and having competent people who are well-versed in anti-racism to assist them and get them through the process. We also talked about the importance of it not just being on people whose jobs it is to take care of complaints, but it needs to be something where leaders are also embracing it fully. And sometimes it was brought up that sometimes leaders will say, well, there's a process. There's a process for that. And we talked about the fact that you can't absolve yourself from responsibilities in front of you by saying there's a process, because if the process is broken, then there's no process, there's nothing to it. So we talked about really the importance of people really, I guess, taking it seriously and making it very intentional in terms of looking at what we can do. We talked also about the whole idea of fit as a barrier. A number of people on the chat talked about being told, oh, you're not a fit for this role, or if they're hired in, and then sometimes, they might end up going back to their old job because, again, they're told they're not a fit. So we talked about whose culture are we referring to when we talk about fit? Do Black bodies fit in that culture? Is there a place for us? What does that mean? We also talked about there's the whole willingness as well for people to engage in conversations around anti-Black racism, and there hasn't always been an appetite for that, and that has been an issue where, if you brought things forward, there was a lot of resistance, and that then you can't then have open dialogue about what it means and what you're experiencing in the institution. We talked a little bit about Black staff being tasked with EDI efforts and as not being part of their formal role, done off the side of their desk, and there being no formal recognition or compensation. So the people who need to benefit from things changing are the ones who have the work put on them, and that being definitely a challenge and barrier. We also talked about data collection tools and and that we should be looking at how to hold institutions accountable. And that's, I guess, to be continued tomorrow when we talk about that in great detail. But one of the things that was raised was, do we publish the data? Do we publish people's stats, so to speak, on how they're doing with different initiatives they take on? For opportunities for change, we talked about, obviously, the current political movement, obviously, the instances that we've seen in the last few months of anti-Black racism and what have you, have finally opened up people's eyes to what's going on. And there's an appetite now for discussions that weren't necessarily welcomed before. So definitely seeing that as an opportunity that for change and that we can get in there. We talked about leveraging existing tools. So the Anti-Racism Act, Employment Equity Act, human rights legislation, they're not perfect, but they are things that we can leverage better in order to create opportunities for change. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about employee assistance programs and looking at them as opportunities to look at benefits, programs, resources. What things can we do to adjust those and make them more open and welcome to everybody, including issues that come up for Black people. And that also means looking at trainers from non-traditional backgrounds. I think that's about it. I think my time is up, so I'm going to respect that. And looking forward to tomorrow's continued conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. That was great. I'm so interested to now hear from Alyssa, who's going to speak to faculty access and success. And I'm going to be keenly listening to see if there are any overlaps, of course, on the non-academic side and to what extent that there are differences. So over to you, Alyssa.
Thank you. And I think there are probably some overlaps. So in the words of one of our panelists, this moment calls for us to harness the energies of Nina Simone's words, freedom is no fear. Another panelist emphasized that the moment calls for us to disturb our neighbor, in the words of Bob Marley. And a third panelist challenged us to imagine what racial literacy might look like if it centered Black lived experiences in this moment. One of the common explanations for Black faculty underrepresentation in higher education is that it is a pipeline issue. While this certainly plays its part in, for instance, the racist streaming of Black children in the high school system, several panelists emphasized that pipeline explanations too often let systemic discrimination in the academy off the hook. In other words, in shifting the institutional geography of the problem, and to be clear, the problem is not the Black community, the pipeline becomes shorthand for the reproduction of white normativity in higher education. So panelists went on then to identify a number of ways in which this normativity is reinforced with deleterious consequences for career advancement and the health and well-being of Black colleagues. The language of diversity that frankly shies away from naming anti-Black racism and Black exclusion directly. The absence of mentoring across the academic careers of Black faculty from pre-tenure all the way up to senior administration. Being made to feel as if one is a token hire or that one's research interests are not academically robust or significant. Having to navigate a work culture that is deeply paternalistic, racist, alienating, and invisibilizing. Having to navigate an academic environment that reproduces the status quo. In STEM, for instance, scientific networks are based on pedigree, who trained you, and this extends into a chain reaction network of self-promotion of this exclusive and rarefied circle, from the reviewing of each other's grants to recommending names for plenaries and conferences, to recommending for CRC, securing course releases, the list goes on. The underrepresentation and the work of being picked on as the token Black, what one panelist referred to as the maid and mammy syndrome. On the other hand, especially when numbers are few, Black faculty do the loving work of mentoring, supporting and working with Black students, staff, and each other in often hostile climates where the specific concerns faced are never comprehensively or institutionally addressed. We do the lifting and it is rarely recognized, but the issue of responsibility must be answered. This affects us, but again, as panelists emphasize, this is not a Black problem. Our second session shifted focus to opportunities, or what one panelist beautifully shifted to describe as the language of reparations. And just a few things here. Working with the Black community to generate disaggregated data that can attend intersectionally to the issues that are faced by Black faculty. One familiar example underlined in our session was a focus on the undifferentiated language of gender equity in terms of career and administration promotion that ended up benefiting predominantly white women in Canada. Institutional accountability that is not symbolic and that is actually accompanied by real disciplinary action for racism and anti-Black racism. Black Faculty Association. So one colleague spoke about a 4-tier mentoring approach in her association that ranged from undergraduates through grad students, postdocs, and faculty, supported through dedicated funds from the highest offices at her university. Working with and learning from Indigenous colleagues, not at the expense of and not in competition with either. And another example that was given was of an Indigenous postdoctoral fellowship program where the postdoctoral fellows transitioned to faculty positions. So working with and learning from Indigenous colleagues about how to make some of those changes to Black faculty or Black potential faculty. robust discussions about job ads that confront the realities of structural racism that shape Black career trajectories, that address the heterogeneous experiences of the Black community in the design of the job ad, and that give meaningful substance to academic excellence in ways that can depart from narrow and deeply exclusionary prototypes of the ideal candidate. And this goes to the fit point that Heather spoke about in relation to staff. And finally, and very boldly, cluster hires, which allows us to change our institutions by the strength of the Black presence, and that can offer a mutually supportive space for Black colleagues who are hired together, creates a space for Black colleagues to bring our authentic selves to teaching, mentoring, engaging with academic and wider communities. Given our uneven experiences across different geographies and institutions, what we left with was the importance of learning from each other, building momentum across our various communities. Many of these are questions that are going to be taken up tomorrow when we start thinking about institutional and sectoral responses. And that's it for my session. Thank you. And thanks to my panelists who brought amazing energy, and the folks who brought wonderful questions to bear on the discussions.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was great. I really enjoyed in particular the comments around gender equity and how the concerns of Black faculty in particular get lost in that discussion. I just quickly was once involved, recently involved in a discussion where the idea of intersectionality was thrown back at me as a reason not to invest in Black scholarship, that we need to sort of be more even-handed in the way that we distribute our resources. So I thought, it's very interesting the way that these language and these different interests are getting played out. Dexter, I think that you had the session that was committed to looking at inclusive decision-making structures. Very interested to hear what you learned.
I'd like to start off by thanking my panelists. We had some very robust, rich, and divergent conversations, and I think divergence brings wisdom. So I was really appreciative for the broad set of perspectives that were presented during that panel. So we started off our discussion by really sort of trying to decontextualize what does it mean in order to have Black leadership in inclusive decision-making. And I think there was some wide discussion that it really relates to more than just putting a Black person at a table or putting a Black person on a committee. That organizations, in order to grow and to change and to evolve, that they must have critical voices that would question their decision-making and push them to think in different directions. So we talked about the heterogeneity among Black individuals and Black ideology, and this is not a homogeneous group. And we also talked about the tensions in terms of Black senior leaders. Once they move into those positions, they have this sort of dueling identities between both protecting the institution and at the same time being called upon to challenge the institutions to grow. So again, it's more than just putting a face on a committee or in a leadership role, because very often some persons might be in that role, but they very much uphold the status quo. And they could very much unintendedly uphold a culture of white supremacy culture. So again, it's really important to have a critical eye in terms of, as we develop leadership, making sure that the leadership holds the institution responsible, but also brings a critical lens to the institution, given the fact that we all have blind spots and limitations. We also talked about the fact that in the Western Academy and beyond, that we've had the normalizing of exclusion, and particularly the normalizing of white male leadership. And the notion that, if you had a committee or an institutional structure focused on women's health issues, but you only had men on that structure, that there'd be an outcry that this is unacceptable, that this committee is flawed, that it would lead to inherent bias and limitations and damaging outcomes. Yet at the same time, we've normalized Black exclusion by not having Black individuals in leadership roles or even in scientific roles, particularly when it relates to issues of Black communities. So really sort of rethinking this normalization of white maleness, and in particular, how very often that narrative excludes Black excellence. We spent some time talking about, from a legal perspective, a sociological perspective, and just from a humanistic perspective and human resource perspective, this notion of targeted opportunity hires. And again, the notion of words, how they script narratives, and what are the narratives we want to script. So from a legal standpoint, one person said, it's important to have the word targeted in there because it signals an institutional commitment to do things within a particular time frame and not to have it drawn out for infinity. But we also played around this notion of opportunity hire and how that narrative, again, gets scripted in terms of a deficit model or tokenism. So we started talking about, even in terms of framing the outreach for ads and for recruiting Black faculty and Black leaders, we need to look at languaging. And there was some notion that needed to be re-examined in terms of thinking about targeted, diverse expertise. So really moving from what has very often been sort of looked at a deficit model to really a strengths perspective in terms of targeted, diverse expertise. But the importance of language, again, and how language can either challenge white supremacy culture, or it could affirm white supremacy culture. So that really sort of took us into a very rich and robust discussion around the limits and power and limitations of words. We talked about the power of university boards in terms of looking at diversity, not just in terms of chairs and department heads, but that the power of university boards in terms of shaping the agenda or restricting the agenda of university presidents and other types of leadership. So looking for diversity on that area. We also talked about the fact that all organizations move towards homeostasis. So, beyond the statements, beyond the task force, how do we keep pressure on both internally and externally in order to keep organizations from falling back into the status quo? So measures for accountability, measures for transparency. And then we also talked about the why in terms of why it's important to have Black expertise in senior leadership positions. And we talked about the fact that we all benefit and challenging the paradigm that if you include Black folks, then you're excluding the normal sort of privileged group. So really spent a lot of time talking about we all benefit from Black inclusion and expertise.
Thank you very much, Dexter. I just, in the interest of time, I'm going to go immediately to Desmond, who I think is still on the call, and he overheard some conversations relating to student success.
Sure. With respect to our sessions, I mean, we had a pretty good discussion in both sessions involving both panelist participants and the general attendees. And initially, we started off with a point that I think was really critical, and that is the whole issue of a pipeline, okay, going right back to kindergarten and right through to grade 12. That really, there needs to be a lot more focus on making that a more positive and aspirational, really, experience for Black students. It just now isn't that. Okay, and a lot of that, I think, was connected to the deficit model, and there were a number of points made around that through the session. And historic, the whole historic notion of racism and all of the deficient aspects of it that's been attributed to Black people, which really impacts the kinds of experiences that happens very early on for young people, and really that goes right through the system. So that's an area that folks felt really needed to be fixed, and part of that, of course, is all the denial that goes along with that. So yes, systemic racism and its impact there, and a lot of emphasis needs to be placed on that. And clearly our post-secondary institutions have a role to play there. I think if someone made the point that, we need to work with our catchment. And I think that, Dalhousie, and I know at U of T, and there are other institutions that have access type programming where we connect in the community with schools and so on. That's important work, and that's work everyone can be doing. Barriers like lack of mentorship, lack of leadership opportunities, lack of representation. We talked a lot about that, and it came out in different ways. Basically, folks made the point that we need more Black students on our campuses, we need more Black professors, and we need more Black staff. So we need a comprehensive approach. And along with that, we need to have spaces that Black faculty, Black staff, and Black students can feel comfortable in. And so we had two panelists who both students, one doing a bachelor's, one PhD, and really there was real similarities in experiences with respect to being able to be in a space that is comfortable for them as Black students. And so we really need to pay a lot of attention once students get to our institutions to make sure that the spaces that they're in, the experiences that they're having, are ones in which they feel comfortable, welcomed, and can be themselves. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. Financial aid. I mean, one of the aspects, one of the things because of systemic racism and the long history, we know that Black communities suffer from income inequality. And that's a big deal if you're trying to get into post-secondary institution. So, of course, that was mentioned as well in terms of financial aid and supports. And I think a really important point was with respect to financial aid, we institutions often note how wonderful their financial aid packages are and so on, but they're not accessible quite often. There are a lot of restrictions, and it was pointed out that we really need to make financial aid really accessible. Intentionality was used a number of times throughout to make different points. And I think that the main aspect was we need to be intentional on all that we're doing. That whether it's hiring staff, creating the spaces for Black students to be comfortable, Black staff, Black faculty, one has to be intentional about it. And if you're intentional, you'll be able to get the job done, we'll be able to make progress. And I think that's a key factor from all along the continuum. So we need to look at how we do that in our institutions. Safe spaces was mentioned again. Again, that's oftentimes our students, staff, faculty may not feel very safe on our campuses and in our institutions. And so that is critical if we are going to retain people who at all levels who come there. Recruiting, great, but are you going to be comfortable? Are you going to find this to be a place you can really feel at home and be your authentic self? If so, if we have that, then we're going to have far better environments. So I see my time is up, and so that sort of captures a large bit of what we talked. We had a very rich discussion. I'm very grateful to our panelists and participants and attendees.
Wonderful, Desmond. Thank you so much. I loved particularly what you talked about at the beginning when you mentioned that it was a sort of a whole of university approach that students were very much looking at and for Black faculty and Black staff. And so all of these pieces really as a comprehensive strategic approach need to come together rather than thinking incrementally or in isolated targeted ways about moving this agenda forward. So that wraps up day one. And so we're very much looking forward to everyone tomorrow. Thank you to Heather, to Alyssa, and to Dexter and to Desmond for their excellent insights and summary of our first day's discussion. And I think we have some closing comments now from Mike Degagne. And so thank you so much, Mike, for sending us off in a good way.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for their participation today and sincere efforts to create real meaningful action, as we were told at the beginning. I come to you today from the territory of the Robinson-Huron Treaty here in Ontario. So I'll try to summarize everything that's been said today. That'll be a challenge, but there were four main points I think that arose. We started off by saying that what we were really looking for was concrete action and outcome, leading to the Scarborough National Charter. And so our challenges were, first of all, to identify our challenges, to change those challenges into a set of principles, to take action, and then to make sure that we were accountable. So the four main points that I heard today were about our history, language, our systems, and how change might occur. So the first part was we spoke about history and right from colonial times and the importance in persisting to make sure that social understanding, broad social understanding occurs of this history. We might say, for those of us who have been embedded in the promotion of Indigenous and Black histories for many, many years, we could say, how could someone not know these things? But I think what we need to do is persist so that all of Canada understands the historical context. Second is language, redefining our terms in our own way, because changing languages changes social reality. So we don't talk about equity seeking, we talk about equity deserving. We talk about the word inclusiveness. And when we use that, I think it was said today, who is including whom in whose space and in whose reality? Inclusiveness is a good thing, but in what are we being included? The third thing is we spoke about systems and the judgments that have created the system that we are now in, that have embedded intentionally and unintentionally barriers to Black scholars, Black administrators within university systems. So what judgments have created these systems? How are these judgments related to the marginalization of Black scholars and Black scholarship? And what deficit thinking has created a system where all of these judgments have become firmly embedded? And these embedded judgments now become expectations about the Black community, the tyranny of low expectations. And that we can ameliorate these structures and become more equitable through the work of Black scholars and students leading the way and being provided some space in which to convene discussion and to reach out and make real change. Lastly, how can change occur? We talk about the shortcomings of consultation in the Black community. Consultation that is often predetermined, too short, and not inclusive enough of the value of the lived experience of the Black community. In the Indigenous community, we too are consultation exhaustion. We have been consulted to death. We used to have a joke that said that the typical Indigenous family was 2 parents, 2 children, and an anthropologist. That we have been consulted to death over long periods of time, as you have. And that there's time for consultation to take on more meaning. We need to be a bigger part of the decision-making process through governance and in the determination of our own metrics, that we have a chance to sit and find out what our desired outcomes are for all of the work that we are doing. So generally, I would say that I'm taking away a sense of hope that now is a good time. It is the time for meaningful action to occur, and that the consultations today, the discussions today were very hopeful. Second, I found them very cathartic, both personally and professionally. Many people who have saved these discussions for now and are revealing how harmful anti-Black racism has been to their lives and their careers. And finally, that we can work together to make real change. Let's begin with the end in mind. Let's go forward 25 years and write a speech about how our actions today and in the coming years made profound change for Black lives, Black people in the university sector. So I want to thank all of you for your participation. It's phenomenal, and that we welcome you back tomorrow at noon to further our discussions. Thank you very much.